It was the kind of morning that made you question why you ever went outside at all. The snow had come in hard overnight, not the soft, quiet kind that settles gently on fence posts and windowsills. This was the kind that stings your face and fills the air with a sound that's almost like static, like white noise that never stops. Earl moved slowly across the yard, the way a man in his late 60s moves when his knees have already decided the day is too cold. His boots punched through the crusted top layer with each step. The tractor sat about 40 yards from the house, a dark shape in the dark, outlined by a thin gray light that hadn't quite decided to be morning yet. He had done this same walk, in some version of this same cold, for over 30 years. He wasn't thinking about anything in particular. That's the truth of a farm in winter. You stop thinking too much and you just move through it. Then he heard it. Not loud, not dramatic, just a sound. Faint, small, coming from somewhere near the engine housing of the tractor. He stopped walking. The wind filled the silence. He told himself it was metal. Old machinery makes noises in the cold, contracting, settling. He'd heard it 1,000 times. He kept walking. Then he heard it again. The discovery. Earl is not a man who panics easily, but something made him slow down as he approached the tractor. He couldn't have told you what it was. A feeling, maybe. The kind that doesn't ask permission before it changes the direction of your morning. He crouched down beside the front wheel, his knees protesting every inch of it, and he looked underneath the engine. 2 eyes stared back at him. Round, pale yellow, completely still. At first he genuinely couldn't understand what he was seeing. The shape was small, barely the size of his 2 fists pressed together, pressed up against the warmest part of the undercarriage, where the metal still held a little heat from the day before. The fur was thick and gray and ringed, almost like a tiny wild thing designed by someone who had never seen a house cat and was working from description alone. It didn't run, it didn't hiss, it just watched him, with those pale yellow eyes, barely blinking. Earl would later say that in that moment, the kitten looked less like a frightened animal and more like a very small creature who had made a very deliberate decision about where to spend the night and was now mildly irritated that someone had come to interrupt it. He reached in slowly. He half expected it to bolt. It didn't. When his hand closed around it, the cold hit him immediately. The fur was frosty at the tips. The body beneath was ice cold, too light, the way something is light when it's lost too much and has nothing left to give. He tucked it inside his coat without thinking twice about it, and he walked back toward the house. Natural CTA. If you enjoy stories like this one, real stories about animals and the people who find them, consider subscribing, because what this tiny frozen kitten ended up doing to this farm, I still find it hard to believe. The man behind the moment. The farmhouse was warm inside, but quiet in the way that only certain houses get quiet. Not peaceful quiet, the other kind. Earl had been alone on this land for 3 years. His wife Margaret had passed in the spring, and the farm, which had always felt like a living thing, full of noise and purpose, had somehow gotten smaller after she left. The rooms felt bigger, the evenings felt longer. He still made 2 cups of coffee some mornings before catching himself. He set the kitten on a folded towel near the wood stove. It lay there without moving for a long time, eyes open, watching the ceiling or some version of it, the fur slowly defrosting, the tiny chest rising and falling with shallow, deliberate breaths. Earl sat in the chair across from it and watched it breathe. He did not say anything out loud. He was not yet the kind of man who talked to animals. That came later. What he noticed, and what stuck with him even in the days that followed, was the way the kitten held itself, even weak, even cold, even barely conscious. There was something in the way it watched the room that didn't feel like an ordinary kitten. It wasn't afraid, exactly. It was studying. Like an animal that had learned very early that survival depended on understanding everything around it before making a single move. It reminded him strangely of himself. He warmed some milk. The kitten turned its head away. He tried water. Same result. He tried just sitting quietly and doing nothing. That, the kitten seemed to accept. By noon it had shifted slightly closer to the warmth of the stove. By late afternoon it had fallen into something that looked like sleep, heavy and still and deep, the kind that only comes when something has decided it might be safe enough to stop fighting for a moment. Earl covered it with the corner of the towel. He told himself he would call the vet in the morning, figure out what it was, where it came from, get it sorted. But that night, for the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel quite as empty. The cliffhanger. The vet came out 2 days later, when the roads cleared. She examined the kitten carefully, checked its weight, its coat, its eyes, The kitten sat utterly still through the entire thing, with the focused, unimpressed patience of a creature that had decided to tolerate something it did not enjoy. The vet stood up slowly. She looked at Earl. She looked back at the kitten. Then she said the words that changed everything. "Earl, I need you to understand something. This isn't a stray. This isn't someone's lost pet. I've only ever seen photographs of one of these." She paused. "That's not a normal kitten. The truth." Earl had heard the word before. Manuel, or Palace's cat, depending on who was talking. He just hadn't expected to find one underneath his tractor. Dr. Annis pulled out her phone and showed him a photograph. A wild cat from the grasslands and cold steppes of Central Asia. "One of the oldest cat species on Earth," she said. "Built for extreme cold, built for stillness and patience and the kind of hunting that requires waiting longer than most animals are willing to wait." Earl looked at the photograph. Then he looked at the kitten sitting on his kitchen table, methodically grooming the tip of one paw as if none of this conversation was particularly relevant to it. The resemblance was exact. Dr. Annis explained it carefully. Palace's cats were not domestic animals, not even close. They were wild in a way that went deeper than behavior. It was in the bone, in the blood. They didn't adapt to human company the way a barn cat might. They tolerated it, at best. They survived on their own terms. She said there were rescue facilities, people who handled situations like this. She could make some calls. Earl nodded, said he understood. He did not make any calls that week. The truth was, by the time Dr. Annis drove back down the snow-covered road, something had already shifted in that farmhouse that was going to be very difficult to undo. The kitten had a routine now. It woke before Earl did. By the time he came downstairs each morning, it was already sitting on the windowsill above the sink, watching the yard with the focused attention of something that considered observation to be serious work. When Earl moved to the stove to start coffee, the kitten tracked him with those pale yellow eyes, not warmly, not the way a house cat watches you, more the way a very small supervisor monitors an employee it has not yet decided to trust. Earl started talking to it, just small things. What the weather looked like, what needed doing that day, what he'd seen out by the east fence the afternoon before. The kitten never responded, of course, but it didn't leave either. And somewhere in that silence, letting go had started to feel like something that would cost him more than he was willing to pay. The recovery. Through January and into February, the Manuel grew stronger. The change was gradual at first. A little more weight, a little more steadiness in the legs. Then faster. By mid-February he was moving through the farmhouse with the low, deliberate confidence of an animal that had decided this territory was acceptable and was now conducting a thorough inventory of everything in it. Earl had started calling him Holt. No particular reason, it just fit. Holt explored the barn the first time on a Tuesday morning, following Earl through the side door with the careful, unhurried gait of someone accompanying a colleague to a meeting they hadn't been officially invited to. He moved along the base of the walls, stopping at intervals to sit perfectly still and study whatever was in front of him, the hay bales, the water buckets, the old diesel cans stacked in the corner. He showed no fear, he showed no excitement either, just that steady, patient attention. The two farmhands, a father and son named Roy and Danny, who came 3 days a week, noticed him immediately. Roy watched Holt walk deliberately between two fence posts, sit down in the middle of the barn floor, and stare at the tractor engine for a long, unbroken moment. "Is that a cat?" Roy said. "More or less," Earl said. "Personality. The farm belongs to him now." By March, Holt had established what could only be described as a managerial presence on the farm. He rode on the tractor. Not beside Earl exactly, more on the edge of the seat, facing outward, watching the field scroll past with an expression of quiet assessment. When Earl slowed near the fence line, Holt would stand, lean forward slightly, and study whatever Earl was looking at. Then he'd sit back down, apparently satisfied. He appeared at livestock checks without being brought. Earl would arrive at the pen to find Holt already there, sitting on top of the wooden railing, watching the animals below with the attentive calm of something that had appointed itself to a role nobody else had thought to fill. He supervised fence repairs. He attended to the delivery of new feed bags with the solemnity of a customs inspector. He had a specific corner of the barn he returned to each evening, high enough to see the whole space, sheltered enough to feel secure, and from there he watched the last of the day's work with steady, unhurried eyes. Roy started leaving a small update on the tailgate of his truck each morning, a folded piece of paper. Earl unfolded it one Tuesday to find 3 words written in pencil. "He's watching again." Earl smiled for the first time in a while. Danny started calling Holt the foreman. The name stuck faster than anyone expected. Some mornings Roy would come through the barn door, look up at Holt's corner, and say, without irony, without embarrassment, "Morning, boss." Holt never acknowledged this, which somehow made it feel more accurate. The bond. It was the mornings that changed Earl the most. Not the big moments, not the tractor rides or the barn rounds or the fence inspections. The mornings, the quiet ones, before the day started, when Earl sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and Holt sat across from him on the opposite chair. Holt didn't curl up in his lap. He wasn't that kind of animal. He sat upright, facing Earl, watching him with that calm and permanent attention, the way you'd sit across from someone you'd known for a long time and didn't need to perform for. Earl had started talking more, about Margaret, about the farm in the years when it was loud and full, about what winter used to feel like when there was someone else in the house to complain about it with. Holt listened, or at least he stayed. And for a man who had spent 3 years talking mostly to himself, the difference between those two things had gotten very small. The house had sound in it again. Small sounds, the soft thud of Holt landing from somewhere high, the occasional low sound from the corner of the room, the reliable presence of something breathing in the dark. Nothing dramatic, but enough. The disappearance. The storm came in fast on a Wednesday night in late March. Earl had seen the forecast. He'd done what needed doing, checked the animals, brought extra feed into the barn, made sure the water lines wouldn't freeze. He'd come back inside at dusk, and Holt had been in his usual spot on the window ledge, watching the first snow begin to fall. By 9 o'clock the wind was bad. By 11 Earl couldn't see the barn from the back window. He went to bed. In the morning Holt was not on the window ledge. Earl checked the kitchen, the barn, the space behind the wood stove where Holt sometimes sat when the cold pressed in hard from the north wall. He checked the tractor shed, the feed room. Nothing, no tracks outside. The fresh snow had already covered everything. No sound, no sign. Earl stood in the middle of the yard in the gray morning light, the wind cutting through his coat, and he felt something drop in his chest that he recognized. He had felt it before, 3 years ago, in the spring. That particular silence that means something that was present is no longer there, and the world has rearranged itself around the absence without asking your permission. He walked the fence line. He walked the edge of the tree break to the north. He called out, quietly because he felt a little foolish doing it, but he called out anyway. No movement, no flash of gray fur between the fence posts, nothing. By afternoon the snow had stopped, but the cold had deepened. Earl stood at the window and looked out at the farm and thought, slowly, painfully, the way you think things you've been trying not to think, that maybe Dr. Annis had been right from the beginning. Maybe Holt was never meant to stay. Maybe the wild had simply waited for the right weather and taken him back. That night the farmhouse was quiet again, completely quiet. The chair across the kitchen table was empty. The window ledge was empty. Earl did not sleep well. And somewhere out in the dark and the cold and the storm that was still pressing down from the north, something was moving. The search. Earl was out before first light. He hadn't planned it exactly. He'd just stopped lying in the dark at 4 in the morning pretending he might sleep, put on his heaviest coat, and walked out into the cold without giving himself time to talk himself out of it. The temperature had dropped overnight. The kind of cold that doesn't feel dramatic at first, just a steady, pressing weight against every exposed inch of skin. His breath came out in short white clouds and disappeared immediately into the dark. He started with the barn. Checked every corner, every ledge, every space between the hay bales where Holt had occasionally wedged himself when he wanted to be somewhere that wasn't immediately visible. He moved the feed sacks. He checked behind the old diesel cans. He climbed the short ladder to the loft and swept his flashlight across the floor up there. Nothing. He checked the tractor shed, the small outbuilding at the south end of the property where he kept spare fencing supplies. The space beneath the porch that had been sealed off since Margaret's time, but had a gap just wide enough along the left side. Nothing, nothing, nothing. The snow had stopped falling, but the wind was still moving across the fields in long, low sweeps, lifting the surface layer and carrying it sideways in thin white sheets. It filled the flashlight beam and made everything beyond 20 feet look like static. Earl walked the fence line along the east field, then the north. He stopped at the edge of the tree break and stood there for a moment, looking into the dark between the trunks. He said Holt's name, once, then again, a little louder. The wind took it. He stood there for a while longer than was practical. Then he turned and walked back toward the house. The painful realization, He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and he let himself think the thing he'd been keeping at arm's length since yesterday morning. Holt was a palace's cat. A wild animal, one of the oldest cat lineages on Earth, built for exactly this kind of cold, designed over thousands of years for open terrain and solitary survival. Dr. Annis had told him that from the beginning. He had nodded and understood and then quietly ignored it for 4 months because it wasn't what he wanted to hear. The truth was simpler than he'd let himself admit. Holt had never been his. Not really. He had been a guest. A temporary resident who had made his own decision about how long to stay, and had now, apparently, made another decision. The farm had been a place to recover, warm in the winter, safe enough, interesting enough to hold his attention for a while. But a palace's cat is not built for permanence. Not with people, not with farms, not with kitchen chairs and morning coffee, and a man who had started to depend on the sound of something moving in the other room. That was Earl's mistake, not Holt's. Earl turned his coffee cup slowly in both hands, looked at the empty window ledge, looked at the empty chair. He thought about Margaret, about the particular cruelty of getting used to something being there, and then having to learn the shape of its absence all over again. He was too old for this, he thought, too old to keep losing things. He did not say that out loud. But he thought it, fully, in the quiet kitchen, with the gray light beginning to come in through the window, and the farm outside sitting still and cold and indifferent. The empty farm. The day passed slowly. Roy and Danny came at 8. They noticed immediately, the way you notice when something that has become part of the rhythm of a place is suddenly missing. Roy looked at Holt's corner in the barn without saying anything. Danny checked the tractor seat, almost out of habit, as if expecting to find him there. Nobody asked directly. Farm people generally don't. Earl told them the storm had come in fast, that Holt had been on the window ledge and then wasn't, that he'd walked the property that morning and found nothing. Roy nodded slowly, said animals sometimes did that, especially wild ones. It was the kindest thing he could have said, and it didn't help at all. The afternoon work got done, feed runs, water checks, the slow maintenance that a farm requires regardless of what else is happening. Earl moved through it methodically, the way he had learned to move through difficult days. One task, then the next. Don't look too far ahead. But the farm felt different without Holt in it. It was hard to explain, even to himself. Holt had never been loud. He'd never demanded attention or disrupted the work. He'd mostly just been present, watching from his corner, riding on the tractor, sitting across the kitchen table in the mornings. He hadn't filled the farm with noise. He'd filled it with something quieter than that, something that turned out to be harder to replace. By the time Roy and Danny left at dusk, Earl had made a decision. He would call Dr. Annis in the morning, tell her what had happened, ask if there was anything that should be done, any kind of search protocol for an animal like this, any reason to think Holt might still be close by. And if there wasn't, if the answer was simply that wild animals go when they go and there's nothing to be done about it, then Earl would accept that. He had accepted harder things. He made dinner, ate it at the table, did not set anything across from him. He washed the dishes and turned off the kitchen light, and stood at the window for a few minutes looking out at the yard. Then the temperature dropped again, fast, the kind of sudden plunge that means the storm that had paused was not finished. The wind picked up from the northwest. The snow that had settled hard during the day began to move again, sweeping across the yard in long pale curtains. Earl watched it, thought about Holt out in that, thought about that small body built for cold, yes, but still small, still young. Still, in some ways, not fully recovered from the morning beneath the tractor engine. He told himself to stop. He went to bed. The storm returns. He woke at 2 in the morning without knowing why. The wind had gotten worse. He could hear it in the roof, a low, steady pressure that made the old farmhouse creak and settle like something trying to hold itself together against an argument it wasn't sure it could win. He lay in the dark and listened. The temperature inside had dropped slightly. He'd need to add wood to the stove before morning. He was about to close his eyes again when he heard it, faint, almost buried under the wind, a sound at the barn door. The return. Earl was down the stairs and into his boots before he'd fully decided to move. He crossed the yard with the flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the blowing snow, the cold hitting him like a wall, the wind loud enough now that he had to lean slightly into it just to keep moving forward. The barn door. He reached it, stopped. The sound was clearer now. Not scratching exactly. More deliberate than that. Repeated, insistent. The sound of something that needed the door open and had decided that communicating this clearly was the most efficient use of its time. Earl pulled the door open. The flashlight found Holt immediately. He was standing just outside the threshold, covered in snow, not lightly dusted but packed into the thick fur, white against gray, the way an animal looks when it has been out in serious weather for serious time. His ears were flat. His eyes, when the light hit them, were wide and bright and locked on Earl's face with an intensity that went beyond recognition. He was not injured. Earl checked immediately, crouching down, running the flashlight over him quickly. No visible wounds, no blood. But he was agitated in a way Earl had never seen before. Holt did not come inside. He took 2 steps back into the snow, stopped, looked at Earl, took 2 more steps back, stopped again. Earl had spent enough time around animals to understand what was being communicated. He grabbed the heavy lantern from just inside the barn door, clicked it on, and followed. Holt moved ahead of him through the dark. Not fast. He kept stopping to look back, making sure Earl was still coming, adjusting his pace to match. Moving northwest, toward the far edge of the property where the old fence line met the slope that dropped down toward the lower field. The snow was deep out here. Earl's boots went in past the ankle with every step. The lantern threw a wide yellow circle that barely held against the dark and the blowing snow. Holt stopped at the fence line. He looked back at Earl once more, then he looked down the slope. Earl raised the lantern, and in the pale swinging light, half buried in a drift against the collapsed section of fence at the bottom of the grade, motionless and dark against the white, he saw it. Something small, something that hadn't been there yesterday, something that needed help. The discovery. Earl went down the slope carefully, one hand on the fence post to keep his footing, the lantern swinging in the other. The drift had built up fast against the collapsed section, the kind of accumulation that happens in a few hours when the wind is coming from exactly the wrong direction and there's nothing left standing to break it. The fence posts had given way sometime in the fall. Earl had meant to fix it before winter. He hadn't gotten to it. He hadn't gotten to a lot of things that year. He came around the drift and stopped. It was a calf, one of the 3 born late in the season, the smallest of them, a heifer Earl had been watching with quiet concern since November. She'd always been the one that lagged a little at feeding, the one that stood slightly apart from the others when the cold came in. He'd checked on her 2 days ago, and she'd been fine, or fine enough. Or he'd told himself she was fine enough because there was a storm coming, and he had other things to manage. She was lying on her side in the snow. Her breathing was visible, short, shallow movements in the rib cage, irregular enough to be worrying. Her eyes were open but not responsive to the lantern light the way they should have been. The snow had packed in around her legs and flank where she'd been lying still long enough for it to build. Earl knelt beside her and put his hand on her neck, cold, deeply cold. The kind that means time is already short. He looked back up the slope. Holt was sitting at the top of the grade, perfectly still in the blowing snow, watching. The rescue. Earl moved fast. He got both arms under the calf. She was small for her age but still heavier than he'd like, and the footing on the slope was bad, and he lifted. His back objected immediately and loudly. He ignored it. He got her up. Got her weight distributed across his shoulders the way he'd done with calves before, decades ago, when his body was more willing to cooperate. He started up the slope. He fell once, knee into the snow, the calf shifting, the lantern dropping and rolling a few feet before it stopped. He got back up, picked up the lantern, kept going. Holt moved ahead of him, picking the path back toward the barn with the same deliberate efficiency he brought to everything, threading between the deeper drifts, staying on the harder packed surface where the going was easier, stopping at intervals to confirm Earl was still behind him. By the time they reached the barn door, Earl's arms were shaking and his breath was ragged and painful in the cold air. He got the calf inside, laid her down on a bed of hay he kicked together with one foot while still holding her, got the barn door closed against the wind. The warmth inside was immediate and enormous after the dark outside. He worked quickly, dry hay packed around her, the warming lamp on its hook above. He clicked it on and adjusted the angle. Water heated on the small barn burner he kept for exactly this kind of emergency. He checked her legs for injury, none he could find. He checked her breathing again, still shallow but present, still present. He sat beside her on the barn floor and kept his hand on her ribs and talked to her quietly, not to comfort himself, or not only that, because he had learned in a long life around animals that presence matters, that something in a living creature responds to the warmth and sound of another living creature, even when it can't show you that it does. He talked to her for a long time. Holt came and sat near the base of the warming lamp, not beside the calf, not directly involved, just nearby, in the way he was always nearby, present without demanding anything, watching without judgment, occupying his corner of whatever space he was in with that permanent settled calm. Around 4 in the morning the calf moved. Not much, a shift of the front legs, a slow turn of the head toward the warmth of the lamp, but movement, deliberate movement which is different from the involuntary kind. Earl let out a long breath he felt like he'd been holding since he came down that slope. He leaned back against the hay bale behind him and closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, Holt was looking at him from across the barn floor, those pale yellow eyes steady in the lamplight. That expression that had never once in all the months Earl had known him looked like anything as simple or as soft as affection, but it didn't look like nothing either. The shift. Dr. Annis came out the next morning. She looked at the calf, improving, eating a little, temperature coming back to acceptable, and she looked at Earl, who had not slept, and looked at, and she looked at Holt sitting on the wooden rail above the pen with the attentive composure of someone who had completed a task and was now filing it under finished business. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long was she out there, do you think?" Earl calculated. The last time he'd done a full check was late afternoon, 2 days ago. The storm had come in that night. She'd been out there in the cold for somewhere between 30 and 40 hours before Holt had come to the barn door. Dr. Annis looked at Holt again. "He found her," Earl said. "I don't know how long he'd been out there. He came and got me. She didn't say anything for a while." Then, Pallas's cats have an extraordinary territorial awareness. They map their range completely, every foot of it. She paused. He would have known something was wrong with the landscape, a shape in the snow that didn't belong. Earl nodded slowly. "He didn't have to come back," Earl said. Not to Dr. Annis exactly, more to himself. He could have just stayed out. He knew the cold. He could have managed. "Yes," she said simply. "He could have." They both looked at Holt. Holt looked back at them with the expression of a creature that found this entire conversation mildly unnecessary. He yawned once, a slow, extravagant yawn that showed every tooth, then turned to face the pen below and resumed his monitoring. Earl laughed. A short, genuine laugh that surprised him a little. He hadn't heard that sound from himself in a while. The transformation, spring came gradually, the way it does in that part of the country, not arriving so much as slowly dismantling winter piece by piece over 6 or 8 weeks until one morning you step outside and realize the ground is soft underfoot and the air smells like something other than cold. The calf recovered fully. Earl named her Late, which Roy thought was a strange name, and Danny thought was exactly right. The collapsed fence section got fixed in April, properly this time, with new posts and the right gauge wire, the kind of job that should have been done in October and hadn't been. Earl did most of it himself, which took 3 days and was harder than it should have been. Holt supervised all 3 days from the top of a nearby post, which helped in the sense that it made Earl feel observed enough to keep working when he might otherwise have stopped for the afternoon. The farm came back to life the way farms do in spring, noisily, demandingly, with more tasks than hours and a kind of momentum that carries you forward whether you're ready or not. There was planting to prepare for, equipment to service. The east field drainage that had been a problem since last fall and needed addressing before the wet season. Earl moved through all of it differently than he had the year before. He noticed that about himself without making too much of it. The house was different too. Still quiet in the evenings, that hadn't changed, and he'd made a kind of peace with it, but the mornings were different. The kitchen had a sound to it again. The chair across the table was occupied most days, in the way it had become occupied since January. The farm had a shape to its days that had not been there before. Roy brought his daughter out one Saturday to see Holt, who regarded her with the same measured, unimpressed patience he brought to all new arrivals, and then eventually, after 20 minutes, condescended to sit approximately 4 feet away from her, which Roy later described as the warmest welcome he'd ever seen Holt extend to anyone except Earl. Danny started keeping a small notebook of Holt observations. Earl didn't ask to read it, but Danny left it on the tailgate once, open to a page that said, in Danny's careful handwriting, "Foreman present at all major decisions, farm running well." Earl put it back without comment, but he kept thinking about it for the rest of the week. The final morning. It was a morning in late May when Earl first noticed how far they'd come. He was driving the east field, slow passes in the early light, checking the drainage work, watching the ground the way a farmer watches it in spring, reading it for what the season ahead might hold. The air was cool but not cold. The light was the particular low gold of early morning, lying flat across the fields and catching the dew on every surface. Holt was beside him on the tractor seat, not tucked in, not settled, upright, the way he always rode, facing slightly outward, watching the land move past with those pale yellow eyes that missed nothing, that had never, in all the months Earl had known him, missed a single thing worth seeing. Earl slowed at the north fence line and looked out across the east field toward the tree break. The farm looked like itself again. He wasn't sure when that had happened exactly. Somewhere in the winter, maybe. Somewhere between a frozen morning and a snowstorm, and a slope in the dark and a small animal that had done something it had absolutely no obligation to do. He put the tractor in idle and sat there for a minute in the quiet. Holt shifted slightly on the seat. His ears moved, that small constant adjustment, monitoring everything, the way he always did. He didn't look at Earl. He looked at the field, but his shoulder was warm against Earl's arm. Earl left it there. The final line. There's something people say about rescue animals, that you saved them, that you gave them a second chance, and maybe that's true, in the beginning. But Earl would tell you, if you asked him the right way, on the right kind of morning, that the story didn't stay that simple for very long, because somewhere between a frozen tractor engine and a storm in late March and a calf that wouldn't have made it to morning, the math changed. Holt was not a pet. He was not livestock. He was not a symbol of anything, or a lesson or a story Earl had decided to tell himself about his own life. He was just present, reliably, permanently, on his own terms, present. And somewhere along the way, that tiny frozen kitten stopped being a rescue. He became part of the farm itself.